At 5 in the morning, you wake to the anthem blaring from loudspeakers, while portraits of the leader on the walls watch you. You must decide whether to inform on someone today. Your stomach is empty, the markets are empty, and hope is nearly non-existent. You think about escaping, but if caught, the punishment falls not only on you, but on your family and unborn children. This isn't a dystopia. It's the daily reality for millions of people in North Korea. So what would you do if you had been born there? Before we begin the video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Share in the comments which country you're watching from. So today, let's go inside North Korea to the story of an ordinary citizen that no one has told. Chapter 1. Birth and Childhood. When you came into the world in February of 1988 at the maternity hospital in Hamhung City, the first thing you saw was the giant portrait of Kim Il-sung in the center of the white ceiling. When your mother took you in her arms, the doctors first stood at attention before the portrait, then looked at the baby. This order of priority wasn't coincidence, because in North Korea, everything came after the great leader. When your birth certificate was being prepared, the clerk checked your father's songbun class. You learned that your family was in the core class category because your father's grandfather was a partisan who fought against the Japanese occupation. This small detail would completely determine the rest of your life. Your first 3 years passed at home, but your mother constantly had to work because the rice ration given by the state could only feed the family until mid-month. Your father worked at the factory from 6 in the morning until 7 in the evening, arriving home exhausted. Your grandmother looked after you, but she had her own duties too. In every neighborhood there were watchers called Inminban, women tasked with monitoring neighbors and reporting every suspicious movement. Your grandmother had to attend their meetings once a week. At those meetings, everyone criticized each other, telling who did what illegal thing. When you turned 4, you started kindergarten. At 6 in the morning, loudspeakers began playing the song of dear leader, Marshal Kim Il-sung. While your mother dressed you, she taught you to salute the portraits on the wall. At the kindergarten entrance stood a huge statue of Kim Il-sung. Every child had to bow when passing in front of it. When you entered, all the pictures on the walls showed either Kim Il-sung or his son Kim Jong-il. The teachers first taught you how to perform the respect posture. You would stand upright before the portrait, bow your head slightly, your eyes closed. You had to perform this ritual every morning, at noon, and in the evening. The toys at kindergarten were very limited because the country's economy had already collapsed. Instead of toys, they gave you propaganda books. These books told about Kim Il-sung's childhood, how he heroically fought the Japanese, how he fed the hungry, how he distributed healing to the sick. The teachers read these stories to you over and over. You had to memorize these stories because they were asked in weekly exams. Giving wrong answers could endanger both you and your family. When you turned 6, you started elementary school. The school building was old. The heating system didn't work in winter. There were 35 students in the classroom, but seats for only 20. Therefore, some had to listen to lessons standing. Even in math class, there was propaganda. Questions were like this. Evil American soldiers killed 100 people in 5 villages. How many people died in each village? In history class, only the Kim family was taught. Kim Il-sung's birth was a miracle. A rainbow appeared in the sky. Birds sang songs. These were written exactly like this in the textbook. Your teacher, Miss Park, was very strict. If you couldn't recite something you hadn't memorized, you got beaten. One day, your friend Minho said Kim Jong-il's birth date wrong. The teacher called him to the front of the class. She hit his hands 10 times with a ruler. Minho cried but couldn't make a sound, because even crying could require punishment. After that, You memorized the Kim family's dates, words, and songs with your mother every evening. Forgetting was unforgivable. In July of 1994, Kim Il-sung died. The whole country was in mourning. Schools closed, factories stopped. People cried in the streets. You were only 6 years old, but you had to cry too. Teachers were checking who wasn't crying enough. Your mother whispered to you, "Show tears or we'll be punished." So you rubbed your eyes, made them red, pretended to cry. The funeral ceremony lasted for days. On television, the same images repeated constantly. Crying people, those crawling on the ground, those who saw Kim's coffin, were fainting. After Kim Il-sung's death, everything got worse. The Great Famine that began in 1995 turned your life into hell. The rations given by the state were completely cut off. Corn started being given instead of rice. Then the corn ran out too. Your mother made you grass soup. You started eating tree bark, grass, even dirt. Your body weakened. Your hair fell out. You started suffering constant stomach pain. At school, your friends stopped coming one by one. Some were sick. Some had died of starvation. Your teacher, Miss Park, didn't come to class one day. The next day, another teacher came and said, "Miss Park is sick," but everyone knew she had actually died of starvation. The new teacher was younger. She was also very thin. She still taught you to praise Kim Jong-il. "Dear leader will solve the hunger problem. Be patient," she said. But months passed. Nothing changed. Your father brought you something life-saving during that period. Jangmadang Connections. Jangmadang was the black market where people sold everything that was illegal. Rice smuggled from China, salt, sometimes even meat could be found. One day, my father brought home a small amount of rice. Your mother immediately hid it, because the Inman Ban women occasionally raided homes. Shopping at the black market was technically illegal, but hunger forced people to break the law. Your neighbor, the An family, completely disappeared that winter. First, the father died, then the mother. Finally, 2 children remained. They were also found in spring, frozen in their home. No one could help them, because everyone was fighting their own survival battle. The state emptied the An family's house. Another family was moved in, as if no one had ever lived there. When you were 7, your mother taught you to go to Jangmadang. It was a giant open market. Hundreds of people piled on top of each other. Sellers had spread cloth on the ground, selling whatever they could find on it. Some sold cigarettes, some fake Chinese shoes, some sold food. Your mother bought a small package of corn flour from a woman with you. What we used as money wasn't the one printed by the state, because it had long lost value. People were bartering or using Chinese yuan. You noticed something interesting at Jangmadang. Some people were secretly selling song cassettes. These were South Korean songs. After looking around, the seller quickly agreed with the customer, secretly handing over the cassette. This was extremely dangerous, because consuming South Korean media required severe punishment. But some people took the risk. Your family never took such a risk. Because your father's songbun class was good, you had a lot to lose. When you turned 9, the famine eased a bit, but life never returned to normal. State rations were still irregular. People lived pedantic on Jangmadang. At school, propaganda intensified. Now, not only Kim Il-sung, but dear leader Kim Jong-il was also deified. You were told his birth story. He was born on Mount Baekdu. A double rainbow appeared in the sky. A new star was formed. It never crossed your mind to question these, because the idea of questioning had never been taught. When you were 10, you joined the Young Pioneers organization. This was mandatory. All children had to join. At the ceremony, they tied a red scarf around your neck. You swore to remain forever loyal to dear leader. Now you had to attend weekly meetings. The same things were always done at these meetings. First respect posture to Kim, then propaganda songs, then self-criticism. In the self-criticism part, everyone had to tell their own mistakes. One child would say, "Yesterday I cleaned the portrait without dusting. I apologize." Another would say, "When my father was late for state work, I defended him. This was wrong." At age 11, a school trip was organized. You were taken to Pyongyang. This was your first out-of-city trip, because in North Korea you couldn't go from one city to another without travel permission. The bus journey lasted hours. The landscape you saw on the road was shocking. Empty fields, ruined villages, people walking on roads. But when you entered Pyongyang, you saw a completely different world. Wide avenues, colorful buildings, clean streets. This city was completely different from the rest of the country. You were shown Kim Il-sung Square. It was a huge area, large enough to hold hundreds of thousands of people. The guide teacher said, "This is the world's largest square." Then you were taken to the giant Kim statues at Mansudae. There were two statues, Kim Il-sung on the right, Kim Jong-il on the left. Each was 20 meters high. You had to leave flowers in front of them. Then you were asked to make a deep bow. While performing this ritual, there were hundreds of people around, all doing the same thing. You saw something else on the Pyongyang trip. Models in shop windows. Delicious-looking foods were displayed in a store window. But when you entered, the shelves were empty. These were just for show. When foreign journalists came, they took photos, thinking, "Look how rich North Korea is." But the reality was very different. During that trip, the guide told you about the outside world. In South Korea, people are hungry. Americans torture them. In Japan, workers work like slaves. Only in our country is there true freedom, he said. You believed this because you had no other source of information. There was only one channel on television, and it only broadcast propaganda. There was one type of newspaper, Rodong Sinmun, the Workers' Party newspaper. You hadn't even heard of the internet. When you turned 12, childhood was considered over. During summer vacations, you were sent to work in the fields. It was called voluntary agricultural work, but it was actually mandatory. You planted crops and collected grass for hours under the sun. Your hands blistered, your back ached, but no one could complain. It's an honor to work for dear leader, they said. One day while working in the field, an old villager approached you. There was no one around, she said to you in a low voice. "Child, this life won't continue like this. One day, it will change." You were shocked, because such words were extremely dangerous. The woman immediately moved away, but at that moment, something stirred in your mind. Maybe you really had started to question, but you could never say it out loud, because questioning meant betrayal, and betrayal meant death. Chapter 2, Youth. When you started high school at 13, perhaps the darkest period of your life began. The school building was old, most of its windows were broken. In winter, the inside was no different from outside. On the first day, the principal called you to the assembly hall, where a huge portrait of Kim Jong-il hung. The principal said, "You're not children anymore. You will become true revolutionaries." These words might sound like praise, but they actually meant your life would be completely controlled from now on. The high school curriculum was filled with ideological education. You had to come to school at 6 in the morning because the first class was reading Kim Il-sung's works. You had to memorize the philosophy of self-reliance called Juche ideology. Teachers told you the capitalist world is collapsing. Only our system stands. Even in math class there was propaganda. You solved questions like American imperialists fired 100 missiles. Our heroes shot down 60 of them. How many are left? Your physics teacher, Mr. Choi, was particularly strict. One day in class, he was telling about Kim Jong-il's scientific genius. Dear Lida rewrote electrical theory at age 10, he said. You questioned this internally, but showed no expression on your face. Because there were always a few students in class who observed their friends and noted suspicious behaviors. These were usually children from Workers' Party member families who would become government officials in the future. At 14, you fully grasped how powerful the Songbun system was for the first time. Your classmate, Jung-ho, was very smart, always coming first in math competitions. As the university exam approached, he wanted to enter the best university in Pyongyang. But one day the principal called him and said, "Your grandfather fled to the south as a traitor. Therefore, you cannot enter Pyongyang." Jung-ho's entire dream collapsed in an instant. From that day on, the light in his eyes went out. He was simply assigned to work at a factory. The Songbun system was divided into 3 main layers: core class, wavering class, enemy class. Your family was in the core class because your grandfather was a partisan. Thanks to this, you could enter a good high school and receive better food rations. But those belonging to the enemy class, like Jung-ho, were punished throughout their lives. They worked in the worst jobs, lived in the worst places, could never enter Pyongyang. At 15, you had to move to Wonsan City with your family. Your father's factory had closed. They sent him to a mine in another city. But you first had to get permission to move. My father submitted petitions for months, bribed many officials. Finally, approval came. On moving day, you set off by truck, but you had to stop at every checkpoint. Soldiers checked your documents, asking where you were going, why you were going. At one point, an officer said, "This document is missing a signature." My father pulled out a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, gave it to the officer, then passage permission was granted. Your new home in Wonsan was smaller, a one-room place. In one corner of the room was a kitchen. In another corner, a bed. The toilet was outside the building, shared. Going to the toilet in winter was torture, because the cold froze your bones. Electricity came only 2 hours a day, so you had to study by candlelight. Water didn't flow regularly either. Your mother went to the well every morning, carrying water bucket by bucket. You didn't know anyone at the new school. Your classmates looked at you with foreign eyes. The teachers were stricter because Wonsan was close to a border city. Therefore, escape attempts were more frequent from here. The self-criticism meetings held every week lasted longer. Once a female student said tearfully, "My father tried to escape to China. I'm ashamed to be his daughter." The teacher scolded her, saying, "You are also responsible for your family's crimes." That girl was removed from school a while later. A rumor spread that she was sent to a labor camp. When you turned 16, your military conscription call came. Mandatory military service was 10 years for boys, 7 years for girls. But in practice, not everyone went to the military. According to Songbun class, some were sent to factories, some to mines, some to the army. Your situation was to go to the military because your family's background was good. When you received the order to go to the military, your mother cried, and your father said, "Serving the state is an honor." but you could see the worry in his eyes. When you went to the military camp, all your belongings were confiscated on the first day. You took off your own clothes, put on the military uniform. The commander stood before you, saying you no longer have individual identity. You are only part of the Korean People's Army. The camp was in a mountainous region of Gangwon Province, surrounded by wire fences. The barracks were wooden, freezing inside in winter, hot as hell in summer. The first 6 months you received basic training. You woke at 4 in the morning, exercised at 5, breakfast at 6, then drills all day. You went to bed at 8 in the evening, but sleep wasn't peaceful either, because the bunks were very narrow, the blankets thin. You shivered from cold at night. The meals were extremely bad. Corn porridge, cabbage soup, sometimes a little salted pickle. You saw meat once a month. Many soldiers caught diseases from chronic hunger. Their teeth fell out from vitamin deficiency. Your commander, Major Han, was extremely merciless. One day a soldier fainted during drill. Han shouted at him, "Get up! Stop being lazy." The soldier tried to stand but fell again. Han kicked him, saying, "You must be ready to die for dear leader." That soldier was later taken to the infirmary. It was said he died a few days later, but the official statement was recorded as accident during drill. During military training, you were taken to areas close to the border. The South Korean border was separated by the DMZ, known as the Demilitarized Zone. When you arrived there, the commander said, "There's the enemy, right there. They occupied our lands." He showed you the other side with binoculars. You saw South Korean soldiers there. The commander said, "They are American puppets, hungry, unhappy, like slaves." But when you looked through the binoculars, you noticed their uniforms were new, their equipment modern. This surprised you, but you said nothing. Ideological education was even more intense. At the military camp, every evening there was a 2-hour propaganda seminar. You were told about the greatness of the Kim family, made to memorize the evil of Americans. One day during the seminar, the commander said, "Kim Jong-il can work for days without eating, develop strategies without sleeping." You thought internally, this is impossible. But your face was expressionless, because someone was always watching you. At 18, you were assigned to border patrol. This duty was extremely dangerous because you had to catch those trying to escape. One night you were on patrol. Suddenly you heard movement in the forest. The commander shouted, "Fire!" You pulled the trigger but intentionally fired into the air. The person running in the forest disappeared. The commander asked you, "Why did you miss?" You said, "It was dark. I couldn't see." He looked at you suspiciously but said nothing. The next day another team caught that person. He was a young man trying to escape to China. They brought him to the camp, beat him in front of everyone. Then they loaded him onto a military truck, took him away. You didn't know where they took him, but he was probably sent to a labor camp. That man's fear-filled eyes stayed in your mind for years. In the 3rd year of your military service, you were told you needed to apply for Workers' Party membership. This was mandatory, because those who weren't party members could never get a good position. Filling out the application form took hours. You had to write about your family background, your ideological belief, why you wanted to join the party. The form included the sentence, "I offer my infinite loyalty to dear leader." At the party membership interview, 3 officials sat before you. They asked you Kim Il-sung's birth date, Kim Jong-il's first speech, the basic principles of Juche ideology. You answered everything correctly, because you had memorized it for years. Then they asked personal questions. Is there anyone in your family not loyal to the party? You said, "No, everyone is loyal." Have you ever been curious about South Korea? Never. That place is hell, you said. You were lying, but it was a necessary lie to survive. A few weeks later, your party membership was approved. You were given a red badge with Kim Il-sung's face on it. You had to wear this badge at all times. If you lost it, you would receive severe punishment. The badge wasn't just a piece of metal. It was the symbol of your loyalty. Every morning when you woke up, you kissed the badge, whispering, "I am loyal to dear leader." In the 5th year of your military service, you were suddenly transferred to Pyongyang. This was considered a very important promotion, because only elite soldiers could go to Pyongyang. A truck took you to the capital. When entering the city, meticulous searches were conducted at checkpoints. Pyongyang residents lived with special permission. Anyone coming from outside was viewed with suspicion. The barracks in Pyongyang was much better. Electricity came regularly, water flowed, meals were more filling. However, discipline was also stricter. Your duty was to guard government buildings. Therefore, the slightest mistake was unforgivable. The commander said, "This is the heart of the revolution. If you make a mistake, everyone, including your family, will be punished." In Pyongyang, you saw foreign diplomats for the first time. They came in black cars. Drivers opened doors for them. Their clothes were extremely high quality. Their watches shone. Meanwhile, you stood guard in your shabby uniform. At that moment, a thought came to mind. Maybe what they told you wasn't completely true. Maybe the outside world didn't really resemble hell. But you immediately dismissed this thought from your mind because it was dangerous. When you turned 23, you were approaching the end of your military service. You who had lived army life for 10 years had almost forgotten civilian life. Before discharge, one final ideological test was conducted. The exam lasted 3 hours. There were 100 questions. Everything was asked from Kim Il-sung's life, Juche ideology, military strategy. You answered everything correctly because you knew nothing else. When the test results were announced, you were told you scored high. You will be a good citizen. On discharge day, you turned in your uniform, put on civilian clothes. The commander shook your hand, saying the party won't forget you. You will always be observed. Though this sounded like a threat, it was a normal farewell, because in North Korea, everyone was always being watched. You were 17 when you came to camp. Now you were 27. 10 years had gone from your life, but in return, you had only acquired a bit more propaganda knowledge. Chapter 3. Adulthood. 1 week after discharge from military service, a letter came from the Workers' Party local branch. When you opened the envelope, you felt your heart beating rapidly because this letter would determine the rest of your life. Inside, a single sentence was written. Wonsan Cement Factory. Worker, start Monday morning at 0600 hours. You had no right to choose, no chance to negotiate. You just had to obey. Just as your father worked in the mine, you would work in the factory, maybe until death. When you arrived at the factory Monday morning, the deputy director met you at the door. He took you straight to the director's office, where a massive portrait of Kim Jong-il hung. The director said, "Working here is a privilege. We're realizing dear leader's vision." Then he handed you a paper you needed to sign. What was written on the paper was simple. You would work 12 hours a day. Salary would be 201 per month. Day off would be 1 day per month. You had no choice but to accept these conditions, because refusing meant rebellion against the state. Your first day at the factory lasted until lunch break. Cement dust burned your lungs. The noise of machines deafened your ears. The temperature was at an almost unbearable level. At lunch break, potato soup was served in the cafeteria, with a few vegetable pieces floating in it. No one spoke during the meal because everyone was exhausted. After the break, You returned to the machines, worked until 6 in the evening. When you got home, you were so tired you fell into bed and instantly slept. When you received your first salary, 201 was in your pocket. But this money could buy almost nothing. The shelves in state stores were empty. Prices were astronomical. 1 kilogram of rice was officially 51, but there was no rice in the stores. Therefore, you had to go to Jiangmadang. There, the same rice was sold for 1,001, so your salary could only buy 2 kilograms of rice. You didn't know how you would get through the rest of the month. Your mother taught you survival methods. Buy everything from the black market. Forget the official stores, she said. Jiangmadang now became your lifeline. Every evening after work, you went there. The sellers were usually women, because men worked in factories or mines. These women brought smuggled goods from China, selling at small profits. Some sold rice, some cigarettes, some secretly sold copies of South Korean films. One evening at Jiangmadang, an old woman approached you. "Young man, I have a good USB drive. It has South Korean films inside. Are you interested?" she said. You immediately shook your head. "No, I don't want it. Because if caught, you would be sent to a labor camp for at least 5 years. The woman shrugged, turned to someone else. But that night in bed you thought, what was shown in those films? Was South Korea really hell? Or were you being lied to? 3 months after starting work, weekly self-criticism meetings began at the factory. Every Friday evening after work ended, everyone gathered in the meeting hall. The director got on the podium saying, "We haven't reached production targets. Someone is being lazy." Then everyone had to get up in turn and confess their own mistakes. One worker would say, "I was 10 minutes late on Thursday. I apologize." Another would say, "I neglected machine maintenance. I was wrong." You also had to make something up, because not confessing any mistakes raised suspicion. One Friday at the meeting, the director was especially angry. "This week someone stole cement from the factory. Who did it?" he shouted. The hall was silent. No one was speaking. The director said, "If you don't confess, everyone will be punished." Then a young worker stood up crying, "I took it. My family was hungry. I sold the cement. Bought rice," he said. The director immediately had him taken out by officials. The next day, that worker didn't come to the factory, was never seen again. According to rumors, he had received a camp sentence. You weren't comfortable at home either, because there was an Inmanban official in your neighborhood. A middle-aged woman named Miss Kim recorded all your movements. She nodded. What time you woke up in the mornings, what time you returned home in the evenings, whom you visited once a month. She rated homes. When she came, she checked the Kim portraits. If there was dust on the portrait, or it wasn't hung properly, you heard scolding. Once your neighbor had hung the portrait a bit crooked. Miss Kim reported this. The neighbor was interrogated for weeks. Inmanban meetings were held every Sunday morning. Everyone living in the neighborhood had to attend. At the meeting, Miss Kim would ask, "Who behaved suspiciously this week?" People informed on each other. "The man on the 3rd floor of the apartment keeps the light on until late at night. What's he doing?" someone would say. "The woman on the 2nd floor shops too much from the black market. Where does she find the money?" another would say. These meetings created an atmosphere of fear because even your closest neighbor could inform on you. When you turned 28, marriage pressure began. The director called you, saying, "You're still not married. This raises suspicion. Starting a family is a citizenship duty." Actually, you didn't want to get married because when your salary barely fed one person, how would you start a family? But you had no chance to refuse. The director said, We'll find a suitable girl for you. This sentence showed you had no right to choose. A month later, the director called you to his office. A young woman was with him. This is Sun Hee. She works at the textile factory. Suitable for you, he said. The girl looked shy, sitting quietly with her eyes fixed on the ground. The director said, "The engagement ceremony will be held next week. Get ready." You spoke with Sun Hee for only a few minutes. You knew nothing about her, but you would marry, because the state wanted it so. The engagement ceremony was held at the factory assembly hall. The director gave a speech. "Young comrades, you will build the future of the revolution. Your children will see the golden age of socialism." Then you and Sun Hee were asked to bow before Kim Il-sung's portrait. This ritual meant state approval of the marriage. The actual wedding ceremony was held a week later. Extremely simple. The state gave a few kilograms of rice, a bottle of alcohol. This was the wedding gift. Families gathered and ate, then everyone dispersed. When you married Sum Hee, you weren't given a separate house because there was a housing shortage. One room was allocated in your father's house. You started living there. In the room was only a bed, a closet, a table. You had no privacy because your parents stayed in the other room. The walls were thin as paper. They heard every sound. Sun Hee was a quiet woman, didn't talk much. In the first weeks, you tried to ask her about her true feelings, but she always said, "Everything is fine." Then you understood that she was also afraid. Maybe there were listening devices in the walls. Maybe if you said one wrong word, you would be informed on. As the first year passed, Sun Hee became pregnant. This was both a source of joy and worry. How would you feed the child when born? You were already barely getting by. During pregnancy, Sun Hee was supposed to receive extra food, but the state didn't provide these. You started working more at Jungmadang. In the evenings after leaving the factory, you did small jobs at the black market. You carried loads, helped sellers, received a few won in return. Sun Hee gave birth to a boy 9 months later. The birth conditions at the hospital were terrible. There was no electricity. They delivered the baby by candlelight. There was no medicine, no painkillers. Sun Hee writhed in pain for hours. After birth, she caught an infection because the hospital wasn't hygienic. She lay in fever for a few days, but you couldn't find medicine. Finally, you bought smuggled antibiotics at Jungmadang. It was very expensive, but there was no other choice. Sun Hee slowly recovered, but this experience traumatized her. You named the baby Min Jun. You received no help from the state for him. There were no diapers. You used cloth. There was no formula. Sun Hee breastfed, but because she was insufficiently nourished, her milk was scarce. The baby constantly cried hungry. You couldn't sleep at night because the crying sound disturbed the entire apartment. Miss Kim came one day, saying, "Silence the baby, neighbors are complaining." You replied, "He's hungry, what can we do?" She said coldly, "Work more." As Min Jun grew, expenses increased. Now even 2 salaries weren't feeding your family. Sun Hee took leave from the factory, became a seller at Jungmadang. She started selling smuggled goods from China. This was illegal, but as long as you bribed officials, they turned a blind eye. Sun Hee sat at the market from morning to evening. Whether in cold or heat didn't matter. But her earnings were very little because everyone was selling the same thing. When you turned 30, life had become a routine. You woke at 5 in the morning, were at the factory at 6, left at 6 in the evening. Then you went to Jungmadang, did small jobs, returned home at 9 at night. You ate, slept, the next day the same cycle repeated. You worked even on weekends because the state organized voluntary construction work. Actually, it was mandatory. If you didn't go, you were reported. One Sunday, you were sent to repair a building voluntarily. With the group, you carried bricks, mixed cement, climbed scaffolding. You had no work clothes, no special equipment, no safety measures. At lunch break, a worker fell from the scaffolding. When his head hit the ground, he was covered in blood. Everyone ran, but no ambulance came. A truck came, threw the man in the back, took him away. In the evening, you learned the man had died on the way. The next day, at the factory, you continued working as if nothing had happened. That night at home, you talked with Sun Hee. "Will this life continue like this?" you asked. Sun Hee warned you, "Be quiet. The walls might be listening." But you continued. "Min Jun will grow up. Will he also live the same hell?" Sun Hee started crying, saying, "We have no other choice." That night, you lay in bed but couldn't sleep. You looked at the ceiling and thought, maybe there was escape. Maybe you could cross the Chinese border. But if caught, you would receive 3-generation camp punishment. Your father, you, Min Jun, all would die in camp. Could you take the risk? The next morning when you went to the factory, you performed the respect posture to the Kim portrait. As usual, you stood at the machines, breathed the cement dust, listened to the noise. This was your life. It wouldn't change, at least not anytime soon. Your only hope was, maybe, one day, the system would collapse. But until that day, you had to survive. You, Sun Hee, Min Jun, all 3 of you would continue living this nightmare because you were born in North Korea. This alone was a crime, but you were paying the punishment for life. Chapter 4. Pressure and Control. When you were 32, you noticed your neighbor, the Back family, had disappeared overnight. In the morning, going to work, you saw their door was sealed. When you returned home in the evening, apartment residents were whispering, "Miss." Kim called an emergency meeting. Everyone went downstairs. The Bok family turned out to be traitors. They watched South Korean propaganda. All were taken away, she said. Then she added, "If anyone sees anything suspicious, they must report immediately. Otherwise, they're also considered accomplices." That night in bed you thought, the Back family had an 8-year-old girl. Was she also sent to a labor camp? You knew the answer. Yes, there was 3-generation punishment. Her grandfather, her father, herself, even children born in the future, were camp prisoners. 2 weeks later, an extraordinary meeting was held at the factory. The director got on the podium with 2 security officers standing beside him. "There was a traitor among us," he said. Everyone waited silently. Worker Lee was caught. Illegal films were found in his house. Lee was a middle-aged man who worked the same shift as you. He wasn't at his place when he came in the morning, but now you were learning the reason. The director continued, "Lee destroyed not only himself, but his family. His wife, 2 children, elderly mother, all were considered accomplices. No one moved in the meeting hall because everyone was experiencing the same fear. If you were caught, Sun Hee, Min Jun, even your elderly father would go." That evening when you got home, you asked Sun Hee, "There's nothing illegal at home, is there?" She shook her head, but there was fear in her eyes. "Once at Jangmadang, someone wanted to give me a USB drive. I didn't take it," she said. You breathed a sigh of relief because you knew USB drives usually had South Korean series, films, or music. Watching these could require the death penalty. The state had established special teams. They raided at night, searching homes. They checked televisions, DVD players, computers. If they found something illegal, immediate arrest occurred. One of the neighbors had been subjected to a night raid. At 3 o'clock, they broke down the doors and entered, searched everywhere in the house, looked under pillows, behind closets, even in the attic. They found nothing, but still took the family for interrogation. Interrogation continued until morning. The neighbor had told, "Where did you buy it? From whom did you buy it? To whom did you give it?" They asked over and over. That family came out clean, but was now constantly watched. Ms. Kim reported their every movement because a family once suspected could never completely clear themselves. A month later, a new rule was announced at the factory. Everyone had to register their cell phone. Yes, there were cell phones in North Korea, but very restricted. You could only make domestic calls. There was no internet. International calls were absolutely forbidden. The state listened to all conversations. If you said something suspicious, you were immediately put under surveillance. During registration, you had to report your phone's IMEI number. Every person you called, conversation durations. The official warned, if illegal files are found on the phone, the punishment will be very severe. Sun-hee had a phone because she had to communicate with customers while selling at Jangmadang. But even she was very careful when talking on the phone. One day, her customer asked, "When will goods from China arrive?" Sun-hee immediately hung up, saying, "I don't know. I can't have illegal conversations." Because bringing goods from China was technically smuggling. If these conversations were listened to, problems could arise. At 33, there was a radio inspection. In North Korea, all radios were sealed by the state. You could only listen to state stations. It was impossible to switch to another frequency. Every year, officials came to homes to check the seal. If the seal was broken, meaning you tried to listen to illegal broadcasts, you received severe punishment. Ms. Kim's son once broke the seal out of curiosity, tried to listen to South Korean radio, was caught, was held in detention for 6 months. On that inspection day, officials came to the apartment. They went through each unit one by one, checking radios. Your radio was clean because you had never touched the seal. But a family on the 3rd floor's radio had a damaged seal. The family pleaded, "We didn't do it. Maybe it happened during moving," but the officials didn't listen. They confiscated the radio, took the family to the police station. A week later, that family returned to the apartment, but their father didn't come. They just said he was sent to an education camp. No one knew when he would return. Televisions were similarly controlled. There was only one channel, Korean Central Television. It started at 7 in the morning, ended at 11 at night. Programs were completely propaganda. The news told about Kim Jong-il's activities. Today, he visited a factory, talked with workers, gave them precious advice. There were series, but all were ideological. Usually, evil Americans tried to trick the good Korean hero. In the end, the hero defeated them. Films were similar. War films, history films, each glorifying the Kim family. However, some people tried to catch Chinese signals. In areas close to the border, especially in mountainous places, Chinese television signals could come through. This was extremely dangerous because on Chinese channels you could see the outside world. Special teams walked the streets at night, looking in through windows. If they saw different light colors from the television, meaning a Chinese channel was being watched, they broke down the door and entered. One night you also got curious. You heard some people took small antennas up the mountain to catch Chinese signals. But you decided it wasn't worth the risk because Min Jun was only 3 years old. You didn't want to raise him in camp. Therefore, the television at home only watched the state channel. In the evenings when the news started, you watched mandatorily. Ms. Kim sometimes checked. "Did you watch the news last night?" If you said no, you raised suspicion. At 34, you experienced an incident at Jangmadang. One of the sellers approached you with a small piece of paper in hand. "Read this information, then burn it," he said. You took the paper, put it in your pocket. When you got home, you went to the toilet. Read the paper. It said, "In South Korea, people are rich, free, happy. What's shown on television are lies. Learn the truth." Below was a radio frequency written. Your heart started beating rapidly because this was a direct call to rebellion. You immediately tore up the paper and threw it in the toilet. You flushed, but the pieces didn't go down completely. You panicked, collected the paper pieces by hand, put them in your pocket. Then you went outside, threw them in the trash on the street. That night you couldn't sleep because you kept thinking, was this a trap? Maybe that seller was a secret police officer. Maybe he was testing you. Maybe tomorrow morning your door would be knocked on. You'd be taken away. You lay sweating until morning, but nothing happened in the morning. You went to work, worked as usual. However, after that incident, you started suspecting everyone at Jangmadang. Who was trustworthy? Who was a spy? You didn't know. The same year, another incident happened at the factory. A young worker didn't come to the morning shift. The director started an investigation. It turned out he had tried to escape to the Chinese border that night. Border guards caught him, brought him back. They brought him to the factory square, beat him in front of everyone. Then they started interrogation. Who helped? Who knew? Where were you going? The young man repeated. Only I knew. No one helped. But they didn't believe him. They brought his family too. His mother, father, siblings. They loaded them all on a truck. Everyone knew where they were taken. Kwanliso, the labor camp. Nothing was officially said about labor camps, but everyone knew. In the mountainous regions of northern North Korea, there were large camps. Those who went there never returned. Camp prisoners worked 16 hours a day, died of starvation, were tortured, broke from diseases. Escape attempts were nearly impossible because the surroundings were encircled with wire fences. There were watchtowers, minefields. One day, an old camp prisoner came to the factory. He was one of those rare ones, released from re-education camp. His face was wrinkled. His body had thinned. There was deep fear in his eyes. He worked silently, didn't talk to anyone. One day at lunch break, you approached him, asked, what kind of place was it? He looked at you, his eyes filled. Don't ask, son. It's better you don't know, he said. Then he added, I saw death every day. People fell to the ground from hunger. No one helped, because if you helped, you also received punishment. What that man told haunted you at night. He said they woke at 4 in the morning at camp, forcibly started working at 5, received a bowl of soup at noon, worked until 7 in the evening. Camp prisoners cut trees, extracted minerals, built roads. There were many accidents. Trees fell and crushed people. Mines collapsed. Scaffolds toppled in road construction. The dead were thrown in mass graves. Families weren't even notified. At 35, another loss occurred in the apartment. A young couple on the second floor tried to escape at night, but Miss Kim saw them, immediately reported them. They were caught before reaching the border. The man was brought to military court. A rumor spread that he was executed. The woman, because she was pregnant, was sent to a labor camp. In the apartment, no one trusted anyone anymore. Everyone watched each other, reporting the slightest suspicious movement to Miss Kim. You told Sun Hee, never think about escaping. She wasn't thinking about it anyway, because Min Jun existed. We can't let our child die in camp, she said. She was right. But sometimes at night lying down, you thought, wasn't living here also a kind of death? The same fear every day, The same hunger, the same oppression. Living without knowing what freedom is, not even being able to think your thoughts freely. But you had no other choice, because all borders were guarded. The North Korea-China border was the Tumen River. In some areas, the river was shallow, could be crossed by swimming. But in winter months, the water froze. In summer, the current was strong. Border guards stood watch every 100 meters. At night, searchlights were lit, dogs patrolled. Most who tried to escape were caught. Some were killed by shooting. Some were brought back alive. Those brought back alive were luckier, because in camp they could at least live for a while. One day at the factory, a new rule came. Now everyone would write a thought report when coming to work in the morning. In this report, questions like, what did you think last night? What did you feel about dear leader? How did you show your loyalty to the party? Would be answered. This was completely absurd, because who would write what they really thought? Everyone wrote lies. Last night, I thought about dear leader's greatness, believed in the correctness of his vision, felt infinite devotion to the party. The same sentences were written over and over. But one day, a young worker made a mistake. In his report, he wrote, "Last night I worried about my family. We had difficulty finding food." When the director read this, he got angry. "You're accusing the state. The state feeds you, but you're being ungrateful," he said. That worker apologized, but it wasn't enough. For a week, he was criticized in front of everyone at self-criticism meetings. Finally, he was fired from work, exiled to another city. This incident was a lesson to everyone. Never write the truth. Always lie. Hide your thoughts. Conceal your feelings. Just survive. Because in North Korea, even thinking truly was a crime. You could only think approved thoughts. Otherwise, punishment camps awaited you. You, your family, even your unborn grandchildren. 3 generations would be punished together. That's why silence was the safest path. Don't speak, don't think, don't feel. Just obey. Live, die. Chapter 5. Aging and the Future. When you turned 45, your body was no longer what it used to be. The price of working at the cement factory for 20 years was felt in your lungs, joints, back. Every morning when you woke, your bones ached. Breathing became difficult because your lungs had inhaled cement dust for years. You wanted to go to the doctor, but there was no medicine in hospitals. Smuggled Chinese medicines were sold at Jiangmadang, but they were so expensive that buying was impossible. Therefore, you learned to live with your pains. Every morning, you got up a bit slower, but you still had to go to work, because there was no such thing as retirement. One day, the director called you to his office, saying you're old now, but you'll continue serving the state. When you asked if you could retire, the answer was clear. Retirement is a bourgeois concept. Socialist citizens work until death. This sentence summarized your future. You would work until 60, 70, maybe 80 years old. Then one day you'd fall at the factory and die. The state would also do your funeral. You'd be thrown in a mass grave. That's how your life would end. Sun Hee's situation was even worse because selling at Jiangmadang was physically very tiring. She was 42 but looked 60. Her hair had fallen out, her teeth had decayed, her back was bent. Sitting in the cold for hours during winter months had brought rheumatism. Her hands were swollen. She moved her fingers with difficulty. One evening when she came home, she was crying. "How much longer can I endure?" she asked. You hugged her, but you had no answer because you were asking yourself the same question. Min-jun was now 14, going to high school. The more you thought about his future, the darker your heart became, because you knew he would also live the hell you lived. At school, He received the same propaganda education, attended weekly self-criticism meetings, bowed before Kim portraits. One evening, when he came home, his morale was down. "Dad, will I also work at the factory like you?" he asked. You didn't want to lie to him, but telling the truth also hurt. "Yes, son. Probably so." You saw the disappointment in his eyes. But he said nothing, because the idea of questioning hadn't been taught to him either. However, Min Jun's generation was a bit different, because they were the first generation to secretly receive information leaking from the outside world. Jangmadang was now not just a place where goods were sold, but also where information was shared. USB drives were sold under the table, containing South Korean series, American films, even news programs. Some of Min Jun's friends secretly watched these drives. One day, Min Jun came home and asked in a whisper, "Dad, I heard people in South Korea are rich. Is it true?" You froze because this question was extremely dangerous. You looked around, checked if anyone was listening. Then you warned him, "Never ask such questions. If they hear, we'll all go to camp." But the truth was you were also curious. There were rumors you had heard for years. In South Korea, cars, computers, phones were in everyone's hands. People could travel wherever they wanted, could say what they wanted. But were these possible? Or was it another propaganda? You didn't know because you hadn't seen with your own eyes. You only knew the South Korea shown on state television. Poor people, American occupation, unhappiness, which was true. At 46, one day you met an interesting man at Jangmadang, an old seller who brought goods from the Chinese border. While talking with you, he suddenly whispered, "My brother escaped to China, called from there. He's living in South Korea now. His life is very good." You were shocked because these words would be considered treason. The man continued, "One day this system will collapse. Be patient." Then he quickly moved away. That night in bed you thought, could it really collapse? The Kim dynasty had been in power for 3 generations. Kim Il-sung, then Kim Jong-il, now Kim Jong-un. 3 dictators, more than 70 years. Could there be change? In 2011, when Kim Jong-il died, the country again went into mourning. At the factory, everyone had to cry. Funeral ceremonies were shown on television for days. Then Kim Jong-un came to power. He was a young leader, in his 30s. At first, some people hoped maybe he'll reform, maybe he'll open the doors. But hopes were quickly extinguished, because Kim Jong-un turned out stricter than his predecessors. He made more executions, sent more people to camps. Control tightened even more. At 47, another tragedy occurred in the apartment. A family on the 5th floor committed mass suicide. The father had lost his job, couldn't find food, became desperate. With his wife and 2 children, they drank poison. In the morning, when neighbors broke down the door, all 4 were dead. Miss Kim reported the situation, but no response came from the state. The family's bodies were taken away. The apartment was cleaned. Another family was moved in, as if nothing had happened. But after that incident, you became even more pessimistic, because you understood that in this system, life was worthless. People were just numbers. If you died, someone else came in your place. In those days, the thought of escape began occupying more space in your minds. You and Sun-hee talked in whispers at night. Maybe we can escape to China. From there, go to South Korea, Sun-hee said. You calculated the risks. Crossing the Tumen River, escaping from border guards, not getting caught in China, not being sent back. Every stage was deadly dangerous. Min Jun is still young. He can't endure the journey, you said. Sun-hee cried. But here, were also dying slowly. It really was so. Chronic hunger, disease, oppression, all was slowly killing you. Your bodies were wearing out. Your spirits were breaking. Your hopes were depleting. But escaping also resembled suicide. 80% of those caught were either killed or sent to camp. Only 20% could succeed. Was this gamble worth it? One night you decided you would try, but the plan had to be made very carefully. First, you had to find a human smuggler at Jangmadang. These men smuggled people across the border for money. Then you needed to find someone on the Chinese side who would take you to the South Korean embassy. Every stage was done with money. You calculated. At least 3,000 Chinese yuan was needed. But your entire savings was only 500 yuan, meaning you had to save money for a few more years. At 48, you started a strict savings plan. Sun He worked more at Jangmadang. You found second jobs after the factory. In the evenings you worked at construction sites. On weekends you carried loads. Minjun did small jobs after school. The whole family worked for a single goal: escape money. But you couldn't tell anyone because in Minban, neighbors, everyone was a potential informant. 2 years later, you saved 2,000 yuan. It still wasn't enough. But you were getting impatient now, because with every passing day, you were aging. Your strength was decreasing. Sun He said, "Maybe it's enough. We'll bargain with the smuggler." You tried to find someone trustworthy at Jangmadang, but everyone looked suspicious. Who could you trust? If you told the wrong person, you would immediately be informed on. One day, an old woman approached you. "I heard you want to escape," she said. "You were afraid this could be a trap." "No, I'm just a seller," you said. The woman laughed. "Don't be afraid. I'm also escaping. Let's go together." You were undecided about whether to trust her, but there was no other option either. The woman's name was Ms. Choi. She was around 60. Her son had escaped years ago, was in South Korea. She also wanted to see her son. Miss Choi knew a smuggler. "He wants 1,000 yuan per person," she said. You were 3 people. 3,000 yuan was needed. Exactly the amount you saved. Was it fate? Or was it a trap? You didn't know, but you decided you would try. Ms. Choi said, "We're going at the end of the month. Be ready." Preparation was extremely secretive. You couldn't take much luggage, because it would raise suspicion. Only a few clothes, some food, all your money. You told Min Jun, "We're going on a long journey, but don't tell anyone." He understood. There was both fear and excitement in his eyes. Sun He took the family photo from the wall, put it in her pocket. "Maybe we won't return," she said. At the end of the month, Miss Choi sent word. "Tonight at midnight, meet at the riverbank." You ate dinner normally, wished neighbors good night. At 11 at night, you quietly left home. The streets were dark. There was a power outage. As you walked, you flinched at every sound. You advanced through back alleys, avoided main streets. When you reached the riverbank, Miss Choi and the smuggler were waiting for you. The smuggler was a young man, experienced. "Give the money," he said. You gave the money. The man counted it. "Okay, now follow me. Be quiet. Run." You walked toward the river. The water was ice cold, the current strong. The smuggler said, "The entry point is here. You'll swim across." At that moment, everything stopped instantly. Searchlights turned on. Sirens blared. Soldiers started running. "Trap!" someone shouted. The smuggler vanished. Miss Choi started running, but she was old, couldn't keep up. Sun Hee shouted, "Run," to you. You held Min Jun's hand, started running. But the soldiers were faster. Gunshots were heard. You looked back. Miss Choi was lying on the ground. Sun Hee was behind you, out of breath. Min Jun was crying. Soldiers surrounded you. "Stop or we'll fire," they shouted. You had to stop, because you couldn't endanger Min Jun. You raised your hands. Soldiers caught all three of you, handcuffed you, loaded you on a truck. You were taken to the police station. Interrogation lasted until morning. Who helped? How many more are there? Where were you going? You only repeated, "Me and my family." No one helped. Sun Hee was beaten. Min Jun was threatened. But you didn't inform on anyone else because you didn't know anyone. A week later, a trial was held. The judge read your crime: betrayal of the state, escape attempt, enmity toward socialism. Sentence: 15 years hard labor camp. Sun Hee, 10 years. Min Jun, 7 years because he wasn't younger than 10. All three of you would be sent to separate camps. Maybe you would never see each other again. Sitting on the truck going to camp, you looked out the window. You were seeing Wonsan City for the last time. Here you were born. Here you lived. Here you failed. Was trying to escape foolishness? Maybe. But if you hadn't tried, you would always wonder, what if we could succeed? Now you knew the answer. You didn't succeed. But at least you tried. This was maybe the only free choice you made in your life, and you were paying for it. 15 years camp, maybe more. Maybe you'd never get out. But you knew this. This life wasn't worth living. Being born in North Korea was a crime, but you had to pay the punishment, even though you didn't commit it. The truck moved toward the mountains. The camp was there, behind the wire fences. After entering there, maybe you would never see the sky again. But you knew one thing. In the world, millions of people were living freely. When they woke in the morning, they weren't afraid. They could think their thoughts freely. They could dream of the future. You weren't born with these rights, but maybe Min Jun could have them one day. Maybe the system would collapse. Maybe the walls would fall. Maybe freedom would come. When that day came, you might not be alive, but maybe your son would be. The truck stopped at the camp gate. Soldiers brought you down. You looked at the wire fences. This was where your life from now on would be. But inside you, there was a small hope, because someone else knew your story. The outside world was hearing the suffering in North Korea. Maybe one day, change would come. Until that day, you would try to survive. Because surviving was the last form of resistance. The system wanted to destroy you, but you were still breathing. That's what you would fight for, until you drew your last breath. And you, the person reading this text, please don't forget, this isn't just a story. Right now, millions of people in North Korea are living this. They are human like you, dreaming like you, suffering like you. The only difference was where they were born.